I think what we ought to start with first. I'm going to talk about what a fungus is, what a mushroom is, go over some rules for the road if you're gathering, and then we'll get to the part about looking at some specific mushrooms that we have here in the Northwest. So when you get to the question of what is a fungus, when I was growing up, there were only two great kingdoms of living organisms, plants and animals, back in the 1950s. That has since been revised to 5 kingdoms now that include fungi, monarans, and protists as well. And the last 2 are single-cell organisms by and large that include all the bacteria and all of the blue-green algae. Viruses, by the way, are not considered to be living things. And so they don't have a kingdom. Oh, yeah, it was not until 1965 that fungi were recognized to be a kingdom of their own. Until that time, they had been thought of as plants, but they differ from plants. And so they were carved out of the plant kingdom. They differ by being unable to make their own food. All plants can make their own food through photosynthesis. No fungi can do that. They also differ in having a long polysaccharide in their cell wall called chitin. Chitin is found in many different species of animals and in absolutely no plants. They can't make this compound. It's part of the cell wall, and it's what gives the cell wall of fungi structure. As far as humans and other animals, we differ from in that we have to ingest our food in order to digest it. Fungi, on the other hand, digest their food externally, outside of their bodies. They break down food that they find, organic matter, by secreting powerful enzymes and acids that break these things down, and then they absorb them through the cell wall. That's one of the main differences between fungi and animals. The other being that all fungi have a cell wall, whereas animals have a cell membrane that's flexible and very porous. The plants and fungi both have rigid cell walls. In plants, it's made of cellulose or lignin, and in fungi, it's chitin. The fungal world exists largely hidden from view, except for the mushrooms that come up after a rain in the fall or in the spring. We've come to appreciate through DNA studies, though, that the fungal kingdom is absolutely vast, that there are probably between 3.2 and 3.8 million species of fungi on Earth, which would be 6 or 8 times the number of known plants on Earth. Most of us think of fungi as decomposers. And many of them do exactly that. They turn wood and back into soil again. I mean, they can take a 500-year-old Douglas fir tree that's fallen, and in a few hundred years they can turn that back to the soil and release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So they are a huge part of the carbon cycle. But fungi also have an equally important role in nourishing plants, and that's something that we've only come to appreciate in the last 25 or 30 years. And with the advent of DNA technology, we're now able to study fungi in a way that we couldn't before. But if you look at that 800-year-old Douglas fir tree that soars to 250 feet in height, huge, admirable thing, would be a 6 or 8 foot runt doomed to a very, very short life without fungi in the soil. The plants and animals co-evolved throughout geologic time to be mutually dependent upon each other. Neither could exist without the other. The fungi break down organic, well, the fungi that break down organic matter we call saprobes or saprophytic fungi that depend on a host plant we call biotropes. And we'll go a little bit more into that. For a moment, let's look at the biotropes. They are the majority of all fungi. They form what's known as mycorrhizae with trees and other plants. All trees require a mycorrhizal association with fungi in order to get their nutrients from the soil. Their roots are not capable of doing it very well on their own. So when a fungus spore germinates, it sends out invisible threads that go in search of organic matter to decompose, because it has to eat, and it's either going to decompose stuff that's already dead, or it's going to attach onto the rootlets of a plant. And so the fungus seeks out, the biotropes seek out plant rootlets with these little threads, and if they find one, then they will wrap themselves around it. If they don't find one, they just die. They make contact with the rootlets, they wrap around it, and the tips of the fungi actually penetrate the outer cortex of the rootlets that they encounter. Other parts of the same threads that we call hyphae, which is the plural, singular hyphas, other parts of that fungus ramify out into the soil in search of various minerals, and can even decompose. Some of them can decompose to some degree other dead organic matter, and by ramifying out distantly in the soil, they're able to provide nutrients to the plant that it can't get for itself. Things like nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, magnesium, iron, and water. All things that the plant isn't as good at doing as the fungus. And what the fungus gets out of it is pre-made sugars from the rootlets of the tree, and vitamins and a few other lipids that the plant makes through photosynthesis. So both are happy. Both of them get something out of this transaction that takes place right there where the rootlets are penetrated by the fungal hyphae. You wouldn't be able to see an individual strand or an individual hyphus. They're maybe a 15th or 20th the size of a human hair in thickness. But they do bundle together, and when they do that, they become visible, and we call that mycelium. And you've all probably seen it if you peeled the bark off of a dead tree or something, and seen ramifying mycelium of fungi there. The number of hyphae in the soil is absolutely prodigious. If just in a gram of topsoil, there's a half a mile of these things if they were laid end to end. In a cubic yard, millions of miles. So if a soil fungus is made up of an intricate network of threads that we call mycelium, well then what's a mushroom? Well, a mushroom is a spore factory. It's a fungus's way of making new fungus. It apple is to tree as mushroom is to fungus. It's the fruit of a fungus, if you will. One part of it, the great majority of it, you can't see. It's underground or it's inside of a log. But they're spore factories, and they make millions of spores. It turns out that the vast majority of underground fungi do not make mushrooms, however. And that's because all mushrooms, all fungi, can reproduce asexually as well as sexually. A mushroom is a product of is their way of making spores sexually. But all fungi can reproduce underground or in logs by making spores at the tip of their hyphae without ever having to go through the sexual reproduction cycle. So the great majority of fungi actually don't even make mushrooms. That's only a small minority. So we're not sure what makes mushrooms what makes a fungus decide to make mushrooms when they do. In the case of, say, morels in a burn area, all the trees have been killed. It may be that the fungus senses imminent death and decides to make spores through producing a mushroom. But for the most part, we're not quite sure on what triggers that process. And many fungi can go for decades without making a mushroom. Maybe once in 50 years they will send up a mushroom. So it's very difficult to know what's in the soil and whether a mushroom is native to a particular area or not. Collectively, mushrooms produce about 70 million tons of spores a year in the world. They're everywhere. Every time you take a breath, you're pulling in a few mushroom spores. There are, probably millions in the air in your own home. Not all trees have mycorrhiza that make mushrooms. Many cannot make mushrooms. And so if you were to look for mushrooms under certain types of trees, good luck. You won't find them under, at least big ones, under sequoias or redwoods or cedar trees or yew trees or maples or elms or ash trees or elderberries, on and on it goes. But they do form mycorrhizal associations with certain trees, particularly oak trees and some of the other conifers like spruce and hemlock and Douglas fir. Douglas fir, for example, is known to have at least 2,000 mycorrhizal associates with it. And some of the oak trees that you would find in California, maybe even more. So every mushroom has spores that are unique in appearance. Under a microscope, most of us don't look under a microscope to try to identify mushrooms. That's that's for mycologists. But if you really want to know what a particular mushroom is and it has you stumped, that's the way to do it, is to look at the spores under a microscope, stain them, and compare them to what's in the textbooks. For most of us, we don't have to go to such lengths. We often do spore prints, though. And I have here an example of some of these spore prints. When those mushrooms that we see have an amazing number of shapes, but they boil down to 5 or 6 basic types of shapes. Okay, you can see that a spore print is taken by taking a mushroom and cutting off a gilled mushroom, and cutting off the stalk just at where it attaches to the cap, and flipping the cap over so that the gills are down on a piece of white paper or black paper. You do that and then come back in a few hours or leave it overnight and you'll have a nice spore print. So I've shown several of them here. One of them is from a Inocebi species, has very brown spores. Another has rusty spores that is from a Cortinaria species. And then there's this, on the white paper you see, on the black paper you see a mushroom that drops a white spore print. And so when you have two mushrooms that look a lot alike, one's poisonous and the other's not, you can get a spore print, and often that will resolve the question of what mushroom you have. So the forests, the conifer forests we have in the Northwest are vast, and they are home to many of the most flavorful and tasty mushrooms that are found anywhere in North America. At least 6 of the top 10 species on everybody's list are found right here in the Northwest. There are hundreds of edible mushrooms, but probably most people who eat mushrooms will confine it to just a very small handful. But as for what's edible and what's not, we probably have less than 10 species, deadly species of mushrooms in North America. We have a lot of poisonous species that will make you sick and throw up or cause other bad things. But if you learn what the few deadly poisonous ones look like, you can stay out of trouble. For example, you should never eat a white mushroom, an all-white mushroom. There are some deadly mushrooms that are all white, unless you're an expert. And you should never eat a little brown mushroom. They're extremely difficult to identify.